Now, I know it's sometimes cool to come on here and watch a video with me bitching about the Bears and their current direction and bitch about Jay Cutler and bitch about this and vent my frustrations about that. Never get it twisted, though. I love the Chicago Bears. I live for the Chicago Bears. This is my team till the day that I die. I always love them, even when I hate them. And the one thing that I will definitely say when it comes to the Chicago Bears, you're talking about an organization that throughout its existence has won 9 NFL championships, including Super Bowl 20. This was a team that for many years was one of the real crown jewels and gold standards of the National Football League. It was one of the founding father organizations of the National Football League. The National Football League might not be in existence, let alone in its current level or state, without organizations like my Chicago Bears. And when you look at the Bears over the years, look at all of the great players and Hall of Famers that have played for them, you could put their track record up against anybody. And I emphasize again, anybody. Maybe the closest team, believe it or not, would be the Green Bay Packers. No team has more players in the Pro Football Hall of Fame than the Chicago Bears. Believe it or not. Look it up if you don't believe me. And when it comes to putting together this list for the 5 greatest Chicago Bears of all time, I will say this, that number 1 is a slam dunk no-brainer. Number 2, a slam dunk no-brainer. Frankly, probably number 3, a slam dunk no-brainer. And in the order they were at, 1, 2, and 3, pretty much all slam dunk no-brainers. But after that, it becomes a bit of a crapshoot because you've got so many guys that you could throw in there that you could make arguments for. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that this list is strictly determining the 5 greatest Chicago Bears players of all time. Because if you did 5 greatest Chicago Bears of all time in terms of significance, impact, and meaning to the organization, George Halas would be number 1, and Mike Ditka would be number 2, and everybody else would follow behind. But this is about players, and this is about their contributions as players, their impact, significance, meaning, and greatness as Bears as players. So you won't see a George Halas on this list. You won't see a Mike Ditka on this list. But then you look at all the other Hall of Famers that get left off of this list. George Trafton, Lick Kleiman, Ed Healy, George Musso, Bill Hewitt, Red Grange, Bronco Nagurski, Dan Fortman, Joe Stidehar, Stan Jones, One Play McAfee, George Connor, Bill George, Doug Atkins. I mean, the names go on and on here in terms of Hall of Famers. Even guys that I think should be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, guys like Joe Fortunato and Ed Sprinkle, 2 other Bears that I think slipped through the cracks over the years. This is an organization with great players abound all throughout its 90-plus year history. But ultimately, this list was about determining the 5 greatest Chicago Bears of all time. And mind you, I didn't even mention the Gale Sayers of the worlds and the Dan Hamptons of the worlds and the Richard Dents of the worlds and, the Brian Urlachers of the worlds. There's so many players to choose from. It is really hard. I do think number 1 is a slam dunk. I think number 2 is a slam dunk. And I pretty much think number 3 is a slam dunk. 4 and 5, though, I guess is perspective, up for interpretation, up for what you determine to be greatness when it comes to Chicago Bears. If you disagree with my 4 and 5, I won't hate on you. I won't blame you because at the end of the day, it's a tough list. This was the toughest list for me to assemble, frankly. In part because of my love of the Bears and my admiration and respect and love for all of these players. How do I determine who the 5 greatest Chicago Bears are of all time? Now, the hardest choices actually what came to numbers 4 and number 5 because the players that I just left off the list are guys like Bronco Nagurski and Gale Sayers and, yes, Brian Urlacher. And those are tough guys to leave off the list, and in a lot of organizations, they might be the greatest or 2nd-greatest player of all time. For the Chicago Bears, with their history of great players over their 90-plus seasons, they don't even crack my top 5. But who did crack the top 5? Well, let's get started. Number 5, Clyde Bulldog Turner, one of the great two-way players of the 1940s and early 50s, the 7th overall selection out of a college called Hardin Simmons in 1940. This was a guy that the Detroit Lions, thought they had, so they didn't draft him. The Chicago Bears got a tip, and they drafted him. And all he did during his time was be a 7-time first-team All-Pro. Again, one of the great players of his time, one of the great interior linemen and offensive centers perhaps in NFL history, not to mention his contributions on the defensive side of the ball as a linebacker, being one of the really skilled all-around linebackers of his time in run defense and in pass defense as well. In fact, I believe it was 1942, he actually led the NFL in interceptions. Imagine a center today leading the league in interceptions. He was part of 4 NFL championship teams. Just think about that for a second. The Chicago Bears, excuse me, won 4 world championships in the 1940s, and Clyde Bulldog Turner, make no mistake about it, was instrumental in that. And that was a big tiebreaker to me as to why he would make a list over, let's say, a Nagurski or a Ditka or Sayers, or a Brian Urlacher, was the championships and just how important he was ultimately to those championship teams. And same thing applies for number 4, the greatest quarterback in the history of Chicago Bears. Don't let the Jay Cutler ass kissers tell you any differently. It is Sid Luckman. During his 12 years, after being the 2nd overall selection out of Columbia in the 1939 NFL Draft, all Sid Luckman did was come in and help revolutionize the NFL. Whereas Sammy Baugh for the Redskins was sitting there and showing that the passing game could be a viable weapon and not just be used in emergencies, Sid Luckman and his ability to implement George Halas's newfangled reboot of the old T formation dominated the NFL in the 40s and took the league by storm. Sid Luckman was a 3-time Pro Bowler and a 5-time first-team All-Pro, the 1943 NFL Most Valuable Player, a quarterback, again, that did more. He was a good defensive back. He was one of the best punters of his time, maybe only behind Sammy Baugh. He was the quarterback of the great Bears, Monsters of the Midway team of the 1940s, that great offense that took the league by storm, that everybody tried to copy. He won 4 NFL championships and came very close to winning a 5th one, the same with Clyde Bulldog Turner. I think to this day, you're talking about a Sid Luckman who hasn't suited up for the Chicago Bears in 64 years, and anybody that is anybody with a brain as a Bears fan knows to this day that Sid Luckman is still the gold standard of Chicago Bear quarterbacks, and he is still the greatest Chicago Bear quarterback of all time, and still has records in the organization's record book to this day, 60-plus years after he retired. I think no question when you look at, again, his impact on the team, his impact on the league, his greatness as a player, the championship trophies that he brought to Chicago, I think beyond question you have to say that Sid Luckman belongs on any top 5 list, even one as deep as the Chicago Bears. Number 3, Mike Singletary, Samurai Mike, a 2nd-round pick, 38th overall out of Baylor in the 1981 NFL Draft. When people talk about the greatest middle linebackers of all time, they usually talk about Dick Butkus, Ray Lewis, and then somewhere shortly thereafter, Mike Singletary comes up. When people talk about the great linebackers of the 1980s, they will talk about Lawrence Taylor and his impact and just how great and dominant of a football player he was, and all of that is true. But Mike Singletary might have been the best linebacker of the 1980s. He surely was the best middle linebacker of the 1980s, perhaps the best or one of the best defensive players in the league in the 1980s, which is no small feat in a league that featured defensive players like Lawrence Taylor and Bruce Smith and Reggie White and what have you. Mike Singletary might have stood above as the most dominant, a 10-time Pro Bowler, a 7-time first-team All-Pro, the 1985 NFL Defensive Player of the Year, and on that great 15-1 Bears team in '85 that went on to win Super Bowl 20 in the dominant fashion that they did. He was the leader. He was the captain of the defense that allowed 10, count them again, 10 points in 3 playoff games against the Giants, Rams, and then the Patriots in Super Bowl 20. He was a part of some of those other great Bears teams and defenses of the mid-1980s. He was a member of the 1980s NFL All-Decade team, a first ballot Hall of Famer in 1998. When you think about middle linebackers, you think about players like Mike Singletary. People think about how big his eyes used to get and all of that. And in pretty much any other organization's history, except maybe the Ravens and the Bears, Mike Singletary would be easily the greatest middle linebacker of all time and arguably maybe the greatest player of all time. But he's only the second middle linebacker on this list, and he only comes in at number 3 here for the Chicago Bears. Because I think number 2 is a slam dunk pick, and that is Dick Butkus, the third overall selection out of Illinois in the 1965 NFL Draft. Just think about that, being able to get Dick Butkus and Gale Sayers, two players that dominated the league in their time, two of the biggest stars in the NFL of their time or any time, to be able to get them with back-to-back picks in the same draft. At a time where you had the AFL, NFL bidding wars, George Halas knew true greatness when he saw it, and he knew he was going to make sure he kept Dick Butkus. And Butkus, in his 9 seasons in Chicago, became the gold standard, the true definition of what a middle linebacker can be and should be, and to this day is still the measuring stick of what a middle linebacker is supposed to be in the National Football League. He will probably always be the gold standard and the measuring stick. His reputation for his style of play, his physicality, all of these different things. 9 seasons, 8-time Pro Bowler, 5-time first-team All-Pro, NFL Defensive Player of the Year in 1969 at a time where his team went 1-13. His team was that terrible, and people around the league still thought he was the best defensive player and voted him the Defensive Player of the Year on a 1-13 team. He was a member of both the 50th and 75th anniversary all-time NFL teams. And think about that. That 50th anniversary team was announced in 1969, and at that point in time, he was in his 5th season. By season 5, he was already viewed as one of the 50 greatest players in NFL history. He wasn't even done with his career. He was a member of the 1960s NFL All-Decade Team, the 1970s NFL All-Decade Team. He had 49 total turnovers in 9 seasons. I believe it was 22 interceptions and something like 27 fumble recoveries, if my memory doesn't betray me. His dominance and his importance and his meaning on defense and on the middle linebacker position and on the NFL as a whole definitely cannot be understated. Steve Sabol in NFL Films made him the face of defensive football and made defense, something sexy and all of that. But Dick Butkus, when you think of hard-nosed, tough physical players, when you think of players that bent the rules, if not flat out breaking them, when you think of players that represent the meaning of monsters of the midway, even for a guy like him that never played on a championship team, you think of a Dick Butkus and say that is how football is supposed to be. That's how it should be. And that is what a football player looks like. And that is all true. But he's not the greatest Chicago Bear of all time. I don't even think it's close. No offense to Dick Butkus or any Butkus fans. I think the number 1 player in Chicago Bears history, in part because I still believe to this day that he is the greatest all-around football player in NFL history, is the man whose cheap knockoff imitation jersey I'm wearing right now, and that is Walter Payton. He is the 4th overall selection out of Jackson State in the 1975 NFL Draft. Just think about that. Out of tiny little, at the time, black college of Jackson State, where there were great players coming out of those programs at that time. Heck, one of his teammates, Jackie Slater, would go on eventually, after all this 20 years plus of playing for the Rams, to become a Pro Football Hall of Fame member. But Walter Payton, to me, epitomizes Chicago and what Chicago wants to be and what it hopes to be and what a Chicago Bear should be. A 9-time Pro Bowler, a 5-time first-team All-Pro, who for many years, exhibited and demonstrated his true greatness on a lot of bad and crappy Chicago Bear teams. He had 10 seasons of more than 1,000 rushing yards. 4 of those seasons, he went over 1,500 yards. He only missed 1 game, and that was in his rookie season. In his entire 13-year career, he was a 2-time NFL MVP in both 1977 and 1985. He was a member of both the 1970s and 1980s NFL All-Decade Team. He retired as a career all-time leader in rushing yards, yards from scrimmage, and rushing touchdowns. He was a member of the NFL 75th anniversary team. He was a part of that great 1985 Chicago Bears team that would go on to win Super Bowl 20, a first ballot Hall of Famer as part of the class in 1993. But more so than that, again, Walter Payton, for any Bears fan in the know, they know that when you think of the Chicago Bears and you think about what a Chicago Bear should be, how a Chicago Bear should play, how he should approach the game, how he should work hard, all these things that blue-collar city that Chicago wants itself to be and purports and pretends itself to be, Walter Payton was the embodiment of that, the personification of that. And I will tell you this really quickly. Why is Walter Payton the greatest Chicago Bear of all time? And why is he, to me, the greatest athlete in the history of Chicago sports. I just look at it from my perspective. Everybody knows, I think, that I'm a huge Jordan fan, hence the Jordan tattoo. I still feel ashamed that I haven't followed suit on the other arm yet, which has been the plan for years, to get a Walter Payton tattoo. But at the end of the day, whereas I love Michael Jordan to death, and I love the Bulls and all the great things that he did, if you trash Michael Jordan and you talk shit about Michael Jordan, you're probably going to anger me, especially if you say stupid crap, and you'll probably get me, talking back to you, yelling, screaming, cussing, and all of that. But that's just how it goes. But if you talk shit about Walter Payton, I'm probably going to throw blows. It's that simple. People might look at Michael Jordan as the Chicago athlete of all time. I think you ask the people in Chicago, while Jordan won 6 championships and all of that was great, and they love him there, and he is a king there forever, the God of Chicago, beyond question, was sweetness. Because isn't it funny? A guy from Jackson State, all 5'10" of him, maybe 200 pounds soaking wet, a guy that lacked explosive speed and lacked a great physique and lacked so many things, would go on to become the NFL's career rushing leader, become the face of the Bears franchise for so many years, would finally be a part of a Super Bowl championship team, and really become the embodiment of what a Chicago Bears should be and what a monster of the Midway should be. Walter Payton, beyond question, the greatest Chicago Bear of all time, and still, in my opinion, to this day, the greatest all around football player of all time.